For years, Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, faced a crisis without headlines. The crops were ready, the hands were willing, but the skies no longer answered. In the heart of Huit province, the region of Bama was hit hardest. Its soil stayed fertile, but the water vanished. The government stopped looking, and the people were left waiting. Bama became a forgotten name. Its fields cracked, its markets emptied, its youth disappeared, one bus ticket at a time. But what the country didn't know was that this forgotten place would soon become the symbol of something far greater. Because even as the headlines moved on, the struggle remained, especially in the homes of those left behind. In schools, children learned about agriculture, but when they went home, they saw fields their parents had abandoned. When rainfall came late or not at all, it wasn't just crops that failed. It was confidence. It was continuity. Generations of knowledge began to fade. Some families left entirely. Others stayed, surviving on help from relatives or waiting for food aid that didn't always arrive in time. The crisis wasn't just in Bama. Across Burkina Faso and much of the Sahel, climate change made growing food harder every year. The rainy season grew shorter, the dry season grew longer, and with each failed harvest, Burkina Faso's dependence grew deeper. Dependence on imported grain, on aid programs from distant countries, on price fluctuations caused by wars and droughts happening far from West Africa's borders. In meetings abroad, leaders spoke of sovereignty. But in homes across Bama, people were measuring meals. One small bag of rice might need to last a week. Parents gave the best portions to their children. Neighbors shared what little they had, but survival was not the same as stability. And pride was not easy to hold on to when the land itself had turned its back. It's hard to grow hope in dry soil. But the people never stopped trying. Old irrigation ditches were repaired with buckets and bare hands. Farmers experimented with early planting, dry season crops, and natural composting. Cooperatives formed, often led by women, to find small ways to support each other. But without consistent water, even the strongest efforts fell short. What Bama lacked wasn't ambition, it was infrastructure. And for decades, that kind of investment only arrived with conditions, foreign contractors, long timelines, loans with fine print, and decisions made in offices far from the communities they were meant to serve. So Bama remained a name whispered in development plans, but rarely acted upon. And yet, it was here in this forgotten place that something would soon change. The shift didn't come from a global summit. It didn't come from a new grant or a visit by an international delegation. It came from a decision made in the capital, a decision that saw Bama not as a burden, but as a beginning. Because what better place to start than the one most left behind? In early plans drawn by Traoré's administration, the region surrounding Bama began to reappear on the map, not just as a data point, but as a site of possibility. The government's new vision for food security, youth employment, and national self-reliance needed somewhere to take root. Bama, with its flat lands, its rich but underused soil, and its determined people, became the answer. And so before the first trench was dug, before the first drop of canal water reached a rice field, something shifted. People started talking again. Some returned. Old tools were cleaned. Hands that had gone still began to move with purpose again. It would not be easy. But for the first time in years, Bama wasn't being asked to wait. It was being called to lead. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose to power, the country was already under pressure. Security threats, economic tension, and climate hardship had pushed Burkina Faso to a critical edge. But while many expected a military focus, more weapons, more borders, more force, Traoré turned toward something quieter, something more essential. He turned toward water. Not just as a resource, but as a solution to hunger, to dependency, to the cycle that had kept Burkina Faso in a position of waiting for help, for grain, for permission. For decades, international institutions had offered support, but it came with expectations. Long timelines, imported expertise, aid programs designed in distant cities, projects that promised impact, but often left local communities out of the equation. Traoré decided to take a different path. He looked at the land, at the farmers, at the empty canals once promised and never finished. And then he asked a simple question. Why wait? Why wait for foreign loans when the need was urgent? Why wait for consultants when local engineers were ready? Why wait for international approval when the people were hungry now? In that moment, a new policy was born, not written on paper, but carved into action. Burkina Faso would build its own future, with its own hands, on its own terms. The government identified key agricultural zones with high potential if water could be delivered consistently. One of the most promising was the area surrounding the Goularé Basin, a body of water with untapped potential, sitting just kilometers from the thirsty fields of Bama. The idea was bold: redirect water from Goularé through a new irrigation system, a canal long enough, strong enough, and smart enough to carry life directly to the farms that needed it most. And not over 10 years, not in theory, in 8 months. That was the directive. 8 months to design, dig, connect, and deliver. No consultants, no speeches, no ribbon cuttings with foreign partners, just steel, soil, and Burkina Faso resolve. To meet that goal, the administration bypassed traditional planning channels. Procurement was kept local. Oversight was placed in the hands of trusted engineers, many of them young professionals who had never been given a national project before. What they lacked in experience, they made up for in purpose. Traoré's message was clear: this isn't just infrastructure. It's a test of capacity, a test of trust, a test of whether a country long sidelined could, when given the chance, build without waiting for outside direction. Some doubted it could be done. 8 months seemed impossible, especially without imported machines, external funding, or technical backup from major development partners. And if it failed, even slightly, it would have been used as proof by skeptics that Burkina Faso couldn't build alone. But inside the country, the mood was different. Something was shifting. Cement mixers began to arrive on site before sunrise. Teams of welders, planners, and laborers coordinated with urgency. Supply lines, often slowed by bureaucracy, were tightened. Delays weren't tolerated. Every wasted day was treated like a threat to the country's momentum. This was not just construction. It was coordination. It was discipline. It was belief. For many of the workers, it was also the first time they felt the government's investment reach them directly, not as aid, not as charity, but as employment. The Bama Canal wasn't just about water anymore. It was about ownership, about proving that even in a country under sanctions and strain, progress could still flow, not from the outside, but from within. And so, with no international loans, with no foreign flags waving at the groundbreaking, and with nothing but urgency and national will behind it, they didn't begin with blueprints printed in Europe. They began with a shovel in the soil. From the banks of the Goularé Basin, machines moved slowly at first, carving a new path across land that had waited far too long. The water had always been there. The people too. What was missing was the connection. And now, that connection had a name: the Bama Canal. It wasn't just a trench. It was a promise from one region to another, from one generation to the next. A promise that this time, something real would flow. Stretching across the heart of Huet province, the Bama Canal was designed to carry life to the very fields that had once cracked open under heat and hunger. And it was no small effort. The project would serve 1,160 hectares of rice fields and an additional 70 hectares of vegetables, with over 200 hectares more already marked for expansion. These were not just numbers. They were fields waiting for revival, patches of land that had once been silent, now ready to grow. But it wasn't just about how much land. It was how it was being done. No foreign contractors, no borrowed machinery, no advisors flown in for photo sessions and policy talks. This canal was being built by Burkina Faso engineers, Burkina Faso welders, Burkina Faso workers, people who knew the land not from reports, but from memory, who didn't need translators to understand the urgency, who had walked these fields as children and now returned as builders. Day and night, the work continued. Cement mixers roared before sunrise. Steel was measured and welded under floodlights. The hum of activity became the soundtrack of a region rising. To meet the 8-month deadline set by the president, the site operated like a living organism. Every crew had its role. Every delay was corrected immediately. Officials visited not for ceremony, but for coordination. The entire operation moved with one goal in mind: bring the water. And not just any water. Water delivered with precision, with pressure, with sustainability. This is why, along the canal's length, teams installed solar-powered irrigation pumps, pressure control valves, and began testing for smart monitoring systems, tools to make sure that every drop was counted, that nothing was wasted, that this wouldn't just be a project for today, but a system built for tomorrow. The idea was clear: No more broken pipes. No more outdated systems handed down from donors who would never use them. This would be Africa's most modern community-built irrigation canal, and it would be owned by the people who lived around it. Along the banks, something else began to rise. Storage warehouses, where grains could be kept after harvest. Access roads, connecting farms to local markets. Water hubs, placed not for show, but for need, placed where the crops lived, not where cameras pointed. And behind every structure was a name, a face, a worker who now had a reason to stay in Bama. One by one, abandoned tools were picked up again. One by one, farmers returned to test the new water lines. And slowly, the sound of uncertainty, the kind that had hung over the region like a cloud, began to fade. Because now, the canal was real, not a promise in a plan, not a line in a speech, but a channel carved by hand, wide enough to carry food, income and confidence across a region once forgotten. And while the water had only just begun to flow, what was rising alongside it was far more powerful. Hope. The canal may have begun with water, but it was built with people. Before the first harvest, before a single vegetable reached the market, it was hands and sweat that shaped the future. And those hands weren't foreign. They weren't imported from abroad. They belonged to Burkina Faso welders, masons, engineers, planners, and youth who had once been told they had no place in big projects. On the edges of the canal, machines moved like clockwork, but the real power came from the men and women guiding them. Over 2,000 jobs were created directly through the Bama Canal. Every job came with more than a paycheck. It came with a sense of purpose. In most large infrastructure projects across Africa, the story is different. Outside firms win the contracts. Workers arrive from far away. Locals are often hired only to carry, dig, or clean. If this canal followed that same script, disconnected and delayed, it would have become just another forgotten promise. But here, that pattern was broken. Traoré's administration shredded the old playbook. They built the project on a local procurement model, meaning almost everything was sourced from inside the country. The cement, from local suppliers. The steel, from regional workshops. The transport, managed by Burkina Faso logistics teams. Even the tools, when broken, were fixed nearby, not shipped overseas for parts. This wasn't just a job site. It was a national circulatory system, pumping income, skills, and confidence across Huet province and beyond. Inside the canal zone, the buzz of welding torches meant irrigation gates were being sealed. The clang of stone against steel embankments meant the canal's walls were holding. The hum of solar panels being installed meant smart pumps were almost ready. And through it all, the workforce grew. Many of them were young. Some had never had formal jobs before. Some had left cities like Ouagadougou in search of opportunity and found it, not in an office, but beside the canal. The government didn't just hire workers. They also opened training centers near the canal, offering quick courses in canal maintenance, solar irrigation systems, hydraulics, logistics, agricultural tech. What began as temporary labor was becoming a long-term workforce, skilled, professional, and rooted in the country's future. And as jobs increased, something else began to slow: rural to urban migration. For years, young people had left places like Bama, convinced there was no future in agriculture. But now they were staying, not because they were stuck, but because they could see something growing under their feet. The impact stretched beyond the canal. Local businesses, from food vendors to hardware shops, began to feel the shift. Money was circulating, spending was local, confidence was returning. In the eyes of many workers, this wasn't just about irrigation. It was about inclusion. It was about finally being part of a project that wasn't designed elsewhere. One they could point to and say, "We built that." And that phrase, "we built that," echoed far beyond construction. It reached into homes. It reached into classrooms. It reached into the future. Because when people believe they can build, they begin to build everything differently, from careers to communities. And at the heart of that belief, running steady between fields and workshops, was the canal, a channel of water, but also a channel of work, knowledge, and national dignity. Before the water arrived, the land in Bama waited in silence. Now it breathes again. With every drop that moves through the canal, something changes, not just in the soil, but in the people. What was once dry and forgotten has begun to grow. And what is growing is more than crops. It's confidence, it's control. Burkina Faso is feeding itself again. From the 1,260 hectares of rice fields to the 70 hectares of vegetables, the canal is doing what speeches and plans alone could never do. It is producing food, in real time. Early estimates already show the country is on track to produce an extra 50,000 tons of food per year from this region alone. That means fewer imports, fewer emergency grain shipments, and fewer sleepless nights for families wondering how to stretch a single meal. It also means lower food prices. Local rice is now competing with imported varieties. Vegetables that once came from across borders are now being sold just kilometers from where they were grown. For markets across Burkina Faso, the difference is clear. The shelves are fuller, the food is fresher, and the money stays inside the country. But even more important than the numbers is the feeling. Because for many in Bama, this isn't just a farming story. It's a return to land their families once left, a return to traditions that were nearly lost, a return to being in charge of what they eat and when. Farmers who had once watched their fields go dry are now preparing for second harvests. Women's cooperatives that were once limited to dry season planting now have year-round water. Youth who once dreamed only of leaving the village are starting small agribusinesses, some focused on rice, others on tomatoes, peppers, or onions. For the first time in years, farming feels like a path forward, not just a way to survive, and the impact isn't just in the fields. The entire economy is responding. As food supply increases, food inflation begins to slow. Families are spending less on rice and more on education, healthcare, and small businesses. Local seed banks are expanding. Crop diversity is growing, and the value of land in and around Bama has quietly begun to rise. But the most important shift is one you can't always measure in tons or money. It's the shift in mindset. Because when a nation can feed itself, it stands taller, it speaks differently, it negotiates differently. For too long, Burkina Faso's food system was shaped by what others could offer or withhold. Grain prices abroad, export bans, shipping delays, each one caused tremors at home. But with the Bama Canal flowing, those tremors are weaker. Burkina Faso is no longer waiting at the back of the line when global supplies tighten. It's building its own supply, on its own terms, in its own soil. This is more than self-reliance. It's what many now call food sovereignty, the right to decide what your people eat, when, and how, without being told. It means local diets are respected. It means food comes without conditions. It means that the next drought or the next global shock won't undo years of progress overnight. And it all begins with water. Not falling from the sky, but flowing through a canal. Built by Burkina Faso, for Burkina Faso, in the fields of Bama, you can already hear the difference. Laughter at harvest, wheels turning at mills, vendors shouting prices with pride, children walking past green rows of food their parents planted and now prepare to harvest again. This is what power looks like, not in loud declarations, but in quiet, steady growth. At first glance, it looks like a canal. A stretch of earth carved through the plains of Bama, carrying water from the Goularé Basin to farms that had once gone dry. Concrete walls, steel gates, solar pumps. It is infrastructure, solid, visible, measurable. But ask the people who built it, and they'll tell you it's something more. They'll tell you it's a turning point, because behind every trench, every pipe, and every flow of water, there's a message. Burkina Faso can build for itself. For generations, development was something that happened to Africa, not with it. Decisions came from outside. Funding came with conditions. Projects often arrived late or never arrived at all. But the Bama Canal broke that pattern. This wasn't a donation. It wasn't a pilot test from a foreign agency. It wasn't designed in Paris, approved in Washington, or signed off in Brussels. It was planned in Ouagadougou, built in Bama, owned by the people who will use it. Every cement slab carries the weight of a new kind of thinking, one that says progress doesn't have to wait for permission. President Traoré didn't just set a goal, he set a standard. 8 months, no excuses, no outsourcing, and most importantly, no shortcuts that would leave the people behind. The canal was delivered on time, but what it delivered was far more than water. It delivered trust that the government could move quickly, trust that young people didn't have to leave to find work, trust that the land could still give life if given the chance. For many Burkina Faso, that trust had been missing for a long time. Promises had come and gone, poverty had lingered, and belief in national development had faded. replaced by survival and silence. But here, in Bama, something shifted, because this time, the promise arrived with action. The trench was dug, the water flowed, and the food began to grow. Now, that same belief is spreading to nearby villages watching their neighbors grow 2 harvests instead of 1, to local governments asking how they can replicate the model, to farmers who now plan for the long term, not just the next rainy season. Even vocational schools are changing. Training programs in solar irrigation, canal maintenance, logistics, and agricultural tech are now considered real career paths. Young people are studying how to operate, not just observe. And that's the deeper shift, because when infrastructure is truly local, it doesn't just build roads or canals. It builds citizens who see themselves as capable of shaping their own future. What began as a trench is becoming a template, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the region. A template that says, you don't need to borrow to build. You don't need to wait to grow. You don't need permission to feed your people. And in a time when many African countries are still struggling with debt, food insecurity, and foreign reliance, that message is powerful. It's not about rejecting the world. It's about standing on your own feet when you can. The Bama Canal did not solve every problem. It didn't erase poverty overnight, but it did prove something vital, that change is possible, and that when it starts from within, from the land, the people, the will, it holds. So today, when you walk along the edge of that canal, you're not just seeing water, you're seeing sovereignty in motion, one drop at a time.